Welcome to Conscious Politics Part 1, the next level of political analysis. I'm really excited about this topic. This is going to be a 3, maybe 4-part mini-series, so make sure you stick with me through the end because each part is going to build upon the next, and they're all going to get better and better and better, and it's going to be a very holistic and cohesive topic. And the reason we need so many episodes on this topic is because we're working to address a very deep ignorance within our populace and within our culture about how government and politics works. There are so many traps here and so much ignorance from both sides of the aisle that it really requires a lot of correcting of preconceived dogmas and ideas, which is why we need to go into so much detail. Now, over the last couple of years, really, since Donald Trump got elected, I spent a lot of time closely studying politics in a way that I never have before. And that's because I'm concerned about what's going on, but I'm not coming at it from a partisan perspective. I've been studying this issue from a spiral dynamic stage yellow and turquoise perspective, and I've been having many awakenings over the last 2 years. So as I've been experiencing my own personal enlightenment and awakening, my spiritual awakening, we might say, I've also been experiencing an awakening of sorts politically. And I've discovered some profound insights and principles about various problems that exist within government and politics, which I think will be really practical and useful to you guys. So I really want to lay the foundation here for conscious politics, what I'm calling conscious politics. This is a new type of politics that has really not existed before. This is cutting edge stuff. We're talking about a totally radically new way to think about government. And we're going to start with very theoretical foundations, but it's not just going to be empty philosophy and mental masturbation. We're going to talk about specific policy proposals and what it's actually going to look like. So don't get scared off by this title of conscious politics. It might sound a little airy-fairy at first, but it actually gets very tangible and concrete as we get into it. I'm going to be telling you things that you've never heard about before, a new type of political analysis that you don't see in mainstream media or anywhere on YouTube. And this is going to completely change how you see politics for the rest of your life, for the better. It's going to make you much more savvy politically, and it's going to also give you tools, intellectual tools for arguing with other ignorant people who don't understand what politics is, to bring them around to proper understanding. This is a very sprawling topic, which is going to encompass a lot of stuff we've talked about in the past. So this is advanced stuff. Don't think that as a newbie, if you're just watching this as your first actualized video, don't think you're going to understand. I'm going to throw stuff in here that's going to be very advanced, and I expect that you've already watched some of my other earlier episodes. For example, some prerequisites for understanding what I'll be talking about here will include you need at least a conceptual understanding of non-duality. You need an understanding of spiral dynamics. Go watch my 6-part mini-series on spiral dynamics. You need to watch my 3-part mini-series on self-deception, because there's so much self-deception in this topic. You need to understand survival. Go watch my 2-part series, Understanding Survival. You need to understand collective ego. You need to understand devilry and evil. Go check out my episode, What is the Devil? And the Mechanics of Evil. You need to understand how ideology works. Check out my episode, How Ideology Works. You need to understand relativity and relativism. Go check out my episodes about relativism. You need to understand systems thinking. Go look at my episode, Intro to Systems Thinking. And you need to understand what love is. Go see my episode, What is Love? We're going to be pulling all of these things together. And really, this is sort of a payoff for those of you who've been sticking around and watching this stuff and being diligent and consistent. If you watched all those episodes, now we get the dessert. This is the payoff from having that very deep theoretical foundation. So watch how all this stuff comes together in a beautiful way. Politics and government is extremely self-deceptive. It's not only that the politicians are trying to deceive you, it's that the politicians themselves are thoroughly self-deceived, and you, as the one who's voting for them, is also thoroughly self-deceived. So it goes both ways. It's bad in both ways. It's not only that we have bad politicians, but the people who elect the politicians themselves are extremely ignorant. And so really you can't blame the politicians in a simplistic way that people do. Like you can't just say, oh, it's all Trump's fault, or it's all Congress's fault, or it's all the Democrats' fault, or it's all the Republicans' fault. No, 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 no. You're not appreciating how deep the problem of politics and government goes. But you will by the end of this episode. You're going to start to. Now, I'll be mostly talking about American politics. I'll be using examples from American politics because it's, well, most of my audience is American, but I know a lot of you are also watching me around the globe and you have your own specific local politics. But you have to understand that the principles and ideas that I'll be explaining here are globally applicable. This is not just Democrats versus Republicans. Conservatism and liberalism, these are trends that exist all around the world in all countries. And actually, there's a shocking amount of similarity between the politics in various countries, despite individual local differences. So the principles are going to still apply. So it's going to be useful to you. Now, we're going to have to address so many objections here. So, stick with me. I know you have a lot of objections and questions, so I'll be trying to cover many of them throughout this whole multi-part series. So first, we have to address the elephant in the room, which is the objection of, but Leo, politics is such a dirty and anti-spiritual topic. It's filled with ego. Isn't it just a distraction? I mean, after all, if you just work on yourself, you turn inwards, you become awakened, you just do your spiritual practice, and that will solve all the world's problems. Leo, the world's problems aren't real. They're just imaginary. Like you said, it's just a dream. So why talk about politics? Well, this is precisely false. The world's problems, contrary to what many spiritual teachers will try to teach you, cannot be solved merely by turning inwards. If only if it was that easy. See, there's an individual layer to our problems, and there's a collective layer to our problems. And generally, traditional spiritual schools do a pretty good job of helping us to fix our individual problems, but not our collective problems. And in fact, they contribute deeply to our collective problems. And one of the ways you contribute to our collective problems is by denying that we have collective problems, or by trying to reduce all collective problems to simply individual problems. So this is one of the first traps. And of course, there's also a trap of conflating the absolute with the relative, thinking that just because you become conscious of some absolute truth, some awakening thing, that automatically means that now your politics are going to be in order. Not at all. Not at all. These are different domains. Now, there's important lessons that we need to bring in from the absolute domain into the relative, but we got to be careful about how we do it. We don't want to just do a simplistic conflation here. And in fact, if you take the position that spirituality and politics should be two totally distinct fields unrelated to each other, notice that itself is a dualistic position because you're creating a boundary or a duality between the two. And of course, as you should understand, what non-duality teaches us is that everything is interconnected. When things are interconnected, but then you artificially separate them, problems result. See? So actually, if you think that you're being non-dual by avoiding politics, you're actually being dual. The non-dual position would be to understand just how important politics is towards the raising of the consciousness of society and of individuals. It's a lot easier to raise the consciousness of an individual when he or she is living in a higher consciousness society, and when the society and culture as a whole is not toxic, overly materialistic and dualistic and dogmatic and ideological and filled with cults and filled with partisan politics and dysfunctions and pathologies of various kinds. See? So there's a very important interplay between the two. And if the goal, as the goal is, for example, with Buddhists, is to be a bodhisattva and to help to enlighten the whole world, if that's your true goal as a Buddhist, you got to take politics and government very seriously, because you're not going to be able to do it one individual at a time. See, there are social, systemic problems at work here, which meditation and enlightenment alone will never fix, as important as meditation and enlightenment are. So you got to be careful not to just say that everything is a societal problem, because of course that's not true. You have to take responsibility and develop yourself. That's extremely important. But we also have to acknowledge these systemic problems. When the most conscious people refuse to engage in politics and government because they think to themselves that, oh, well, I'm above all this egoic, dirty nonsense, what ends up happening is that the most unconscious people end up prevailing and taking power. And then they end up governing you. And you see how this is backwards? We actually need the most conscious people to be our leaders, our politicians, our community organizers, precisely because it's the consciousness that they have and the levels of awakening that they've attained, that is what's going to save the world. You can't get some egotistical, neurotic, pathological, deluded person to be in control of large groups of people placed in important positions. Otherwise, what you get is you get disaster. You get disaster. So be careful. You have a certain responsibility as being a human and part of a society to not only wake yourself up, but then to help use that awakening to awaken the rest of the world. By doing nothing, the status quo prevails. You have to understand that with politics, you can't just sit this one out. You can't just say, oh, well, politics doesn't concern me, doesn't affect me. It does. No matter how much you deny it, it does. You can't even live in a cabin in the woods without politics affecting you, because your ability to live in those woods without getting harassed or oppressed or murdered depends upon you being in a country which protects you, which has police, which will have firefighters in case you have a fire in your kitchen in your cabin, which will supply you with food and roads and electricity and so forth so that you can live in that cabin with some sort of sewage system, you see? It's all very deeply interconnected. But we'll be getting more into that in a minute. So the status quo, if you do nothing, if you don't vote, if you don't take conscious politics seriously, is not that you get to ignore politics. The default position then is unconscious politics, which is what we mostly have today. And then you get all sorts of results that are not ideal. And what you really have is you have devilry run amok. It's important you understand the way in which I use the word devilry. I'm not using that word to demonize people, even though it might sound like it. I'm using that word as a technical word to signify deep, blind selfishness and egotism. Go check out my episode, What is the Devil? It's a very important one, especially when it comes to politics. So what happens if you just sit this one out is that selfishness, fear, oppression, and exploitation will be the default, and devilry will run rampant. One of the problems with traditional spiritual schools like Vedanta or Zen or Buddhism, and Christianity too, and even Judaism, really all of them, because they emerged thousands of years ago. They're not good enough to solve today's problems, because back then ecology was not a serious concern the way that it is today. Ecology is an extremely important topic, which I'll have a dedicated episode on in the future. I still have yet to talk about that. But the problem is that many of these traditional orthodox spiritual schools do not understand the importance of ecology. And because people get stuck in these traditional orthodox teachings, they think that, well, these teachings are complete. like Zen and Buddhism and Advaita, they're complete and they're perfect and there's nothing more to add to them. And this is precisely wrong. There is more to add to them. One of the things to add to them is ecology. Another thing to add to them is systems thinking. Another thing to add to them is modern psychology. These are very important oversights that just didn't exist back then, because these are scientific developments that have happened in the ensuing centuries. But a lot of times these get ignored because people get stuck on their favorite teacher or teaching or tradition. Now, what we're doing here in talking about conscious politics is really we're sort of going back to the roots of Western civilization in ancient Greece. Athens specifically, where philosophy and politics went hand in hand. And to be a good citizen, you had to study rhetoric, logic, philosophy, because you had to understand human nature. And in a sense, philosophy was how people did psychology back then. And of course, morals and ethics, that was part of philosophy as well. And it was understood back then that these two go hand in hand. And Athens had some important political innovations that they developed. And the reason that was because they were such good thinkers and philosophers. And so we need to return to that. That's what we're doing here. So even though it might sound kind of theoretical, remember that theory informs your practice. When you don't have the proper theory, your practice is going to be all wrong, which is exactly what we're seeing today in our politics, in American politics especially, and in Europe as well. You're seeing it in South America, in Brazil, and really you're seeing it in India as well. You're seeing the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism all around the world these days. It's problematic. And I've been carefully studying and observing, like, why is this happening? And so I want to share with you some of my insights about that. The first problem for understanding conscious politics is selfishness, bias, and ideology immediately corrupts this discussion. So even as I'm starting to say some of the things that I'm saying, already people who are watching me, who are not conscious of their own selfishness, egotism, their own bias and ideology, who are stuck on some sort of ideology, whether it's a left-wing one or a right-wing one, they're immediately going to try to criticize me because the things that I'm saying are going to conflict with their ideology. And then we quickly get into some sort of partisan bickering back and forth, some argumentation, some debate, and we get into culture wars. These culture wars that we're seeing, these social justice warriors versus the anti-social justice warriors, this sort of left and right bickering back and forth about who can out-own whom, this creates a very big problem because we're not able to have serious discussions about serious issues. This is all distraction. Go see my episode about the ego's favorite defense mechanism, distraction. That's what's happening collectively right now within our culture with regards to politics and government. There are such important discussions that we're not having. We need to create enough elevation from the partisan food fight that's going on right now to step outside of all the ideology and the conventional group think that is infecting both sides, that we need to be able to open our mind to something totally new and not just be picking one side or the other. That's a mistake. It's a false choice. Both sides are wrong in unique ways. And when I say that, don't misunderstand me as saying that they're both equally bad. They're not equally bad. There's important asymmetries between the left and the right. And generally, the right is more unconscious than the left. But see, the problem is that even just for me to say that, already someone from the right hearing that is going to say, oh, well, Leo then is a leftist. That's what he is. Oh, okay, I understand him now. But see, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there's a higher elevation that we need to reach. This higher elevation is beyond left and right. But the problem is that sometimes from someone who's at the lower elevation, it can seem that someone at a higher elevation is just some radical, crazy leftist. And then in this way, one's own bias and ideology gets projected onto another who is actually trying to show you the way, trying to point out things to you that you are missing in your worldview. So be very careful with projecting your own political biases onto me. What I'm presenting here is not a simple leftist position, but it might seem that way to some of you. So watch out. Rule number 1 of conscious politics is that any position that you have is limited and highly, highly partial. So the counterintuitive move then is to stop defending your political positions. Understand that your own mind is tricking you and using you when it is getting defensive about your political positions. See? This allows us to get a little bit of elevation. Conscious politics is about going meta, going beyond ideological positions. And what I'm talking about here, this entire teaching of mine, is a transpartisan teaching. Now, some people can construe a transpartisan teaching as just the other side of some partisan debate. Be careful about that. I'm trying to show you new ways of thinking about politics and government. This is not merely a left-wing position, even though I will certainly be perceived as a leftist. Because the truth is, and this is one of the truths that many right-wingers don't want to hear, but it has to be said, because the left and the right are not equal, is that you cannot be highly conscious and still maintain a right-wing ideology. Those two things are directly at odds with one another. And in fact, the reason people adopt right-wing ideologies, and the further right, the worse it gets, is because they're not conscious of so much. And that as you become more conscious, you'll realize that those far right-wing ideologies become untenable. But that's not to say that you just go full-bore leftist and that there's no problems with that either. There are problems with both sides. Remember, it's not so much about picking left or right, it's about which elevation are you at. That's the far more important metric. And this metric of what is one's elevation, and by elevation what we're talking about is one's level of self-awareness and consciousness. That is the critical dimension that determines the quality of one's politics, not so much left versus right. So in the media, the way that this stuff is talked about, this dimension of low consciousness versus high consciousness is completely drowned out and lost on all political analysis and all political pundits and commentators as they get lost between the left and the right. And in this way, they completely misanalyze the situation. So what you have to understand is that because politics and government are a matter of life and death, the first thing that the devil does is try to demonize anyone who isn't acting blindly selfish in the way that the devil wants. See? The way our politics is done right now is that it's done by devils who are trying to be maximally selfish. And they think that just by being as selfish as they can be, that they will get as much as they can out of the system for themselves and their tribe. And then, hey, once I win that, then everything's fine. Me and my tribe are happy. This is the state of our current politics. This is not going to work. And conscious politics is about going beyond that and recognizing how the devil uses these systems and these ideologies to grab a hold of our minds. Now remember, I'm using the word devil not literally, but metaphorically here. I'm not talking about a guy with actual horns. Okay. So the next issue we have to address is how easily government today is taken for granted. In a sense, we are victims of our own success. Over the last 5,000 years, human civilization has evolved so much that people born today cannot appreciate how much evolution has happened. And they take government totally for granted, precisely because it is in such an evolved state and it works so well most of the time. If you live in a first world, Western-style democracy, either in Northern Europe or in America or a few other countries. There's some countries in the East, like Japan and so forth, which are also pretty decent first world developed countries. In these places, for the most part, you can go about your life and live freely, doing a lot of stuff without ever thinking about politics or the government, because it just works. Electricity just works. Roads just work. Telephone lines and communication just works. The internet just works. Subway systems, they just work. You're able to speak, you're able to go online, you're able to socialize, you're able to do so much stuff. And you've taken all of that for granted as though that's like how mankind has been living in millennia past. This is not at all the case. So it's very easy to not see what government is doing for you. And in this way, we can start to get very complacent, and we can adopt ideologies like, oh, well, government is stupid, voting is for fools, the system is just all rigged, it's all corrupt, government's just getting in my way, government's just taxing me, exploiting me, these sorts of ideologies. We're going to have to spend quite a bit of time combating these ideologies because it prevents us from taking a deeper look into what government actually does for us. And we'll be doing that throughout this series. Notice that government is like a technology. It's a soft technology. It's an abstract technology, which is difficult for us to get our minds around because it's so complex and so abstract. People don't usually think of government as a technology, but it definitely is. In fact, it's more important than the internet or electricity or some space rocket. All of those hard technology, all that gadgetry that I call gadgetry, all of that is only possible because of prior technological advancements within politics and government. Things like democracy. That was an innovation, a radical innovation in its time. Someone had to invent democracy, and it wasn't at all obvious that democracy was right or proper or good, you see, because before democracy was invented, which is relatively recently in human history, it was dictatorship, tyranny, and monarchy, or mob rule, or mafia, or some sort of oligarchy or plutocracy where the majority of people didn't have a vote, didn't have a say at all. It's not that the elections were rigged. There were no elections. And the idea of an election was absurd to people. How could you give ordinary folks the right to decide what the nation should be or who the leader should be? This was insane 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. If you tried to advance this idea, people would say you're a lunatic, you're an idealist, you're a utopian. This would never work. Notions like free speech. This is like a technology. The idea that you should have free speech. Minority rights is a relatively recent development and very radical. A fair judicial system, a competent bureaucracy, religious freedom, separation of church and state, the right to protest, having a social safety net so that if you lose your job, you're not going to starve on the streets, diplomacy, environmental protections, uncorrupted police who you can actually turn to for help in case you're getting chased by a murderer or a burglar or something. Currency, free trade, accountable representatives who you can actually call and bitch to when something isn't going right, who might lose an election if they don't satisfy you and your friends. Term limits, antitrust laws, and I could go on and on and on. All of these things were inventions. Someone had to think of them, and then someone had to convince the rest of the people that these were good ideas, and oftentimes there were bloody battles to put these into place, to confirm that they're good ideas. And it wasn't obvious that they were good ideas. So be very, very careful about just taking these things for granted. These were all very massive innovations. And also I want you to notice that these were radical in their time. See, one of the common problems that happens is that we get stuck in the status quo, in a sort of groupthink, where we just think that, well, we don't want to be too radical in our politics. We want to be moderate. We just want to be average. But you see, the politics we have today, the government we have today is not moderate. Go back 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, everything we have today would have been considered extremely radical by the people of those ancient times. See? And so likewise, we need to be open-minded to the possibility that there might be radical new advances that need to be made within society and within government, especially as it grows. It's also very important to consider the problem of scale. A lot of people think about government without understanding the scale problem. They think of government as though, like, well, government is just like a big tribe. It's really no different than having a group of my friends or 100 people together. No, it's extremely different. And then some people go further and they say, well, government is like, it's really no different than a giant corporation, which has a couple thousand people or maybe 100,000 employees. No, you don't understand. Government is a totally different order of magnitude of thing, even compared to our largest and most complex corporations. Government is something different, very different than any other kind of organization. And I'll be talking about why in a moment, right? We're talking about hundreds of millions of people that many governments in the world control. Hundreds of millions. How do you organize and build a consensus amongst hundreds of millions of people with diverse perspectives, religions, genetics, different abilities, different strengths and weaknesses, different ideologies, different ethnicities? How do you unify that many people? This is not an easy problem to solve. It's actually amazing that government is able to do it at all and that it works as well as it does most of the time. Sure, of course, we have problems, we have corruption, we have war, but generally, you have to admit, living in the 21st century is amazing if you're living in a first world democracy compared to what it was like to live 500 years ago. I mean, it's amazing. You need to wake up every single morning and pray to God that you live in the 21st century and not a few centuries earlier. Otherwise, your life would be so much more miserable. So just keep that in mind. But even as I say that, some people in the audience are still saying, well, Leo, but what has government really done for me? Some people get stuck on this notion that government is just like a monkey on our back and it doesn't do anything for us, and that it just sucks us of our resources and doesn't offer us anything in return. So let me just clarify what government has done for you. First and foremost, and this is the biggest thing that people overlook, is that government protects you from enslavement, oppression, and genocide. This is very important. What people don't understand is that if there is no government, some other group will come and enslave you, and you will have no say and no vote about it. This is a point we'll return to in greater depth in a moment. Let me keep going with this list, though. Government also prevents external and internal oppression. Realize that oppression doesn't just come from the outside, some other country, some neighbor of yours conquering you, but also from the inside. Internal oppression. Exploitation, scammers, Ponzi schemes, religious cults, factions, gangs, mafia. These are all internal forms of oppression. Corporate oppression. Economic oppression. That's very important. Government prevents theft and ensures property rights. Some people, especially the libertarians, who I'm very critical of, they have this silly notion that property rights is some inalienable, God-ordained right that everyone has naturally. This is completely false. there is no such thing as property rights unless they are invented first by the government and then protected through physical force of violence by the government. Otherwise, people can just steal from each other with no repercussions. They have to provide their own security. And then that escalates very quickly. Government also provides you with court systems. And this is super important. People do not appreciate the significance of court systems. A court system is a peaceful means of resolving a dispute. Without a court system, what happens is that people grab their knives and their guns and they go for each other's throats and children. See? So to live in a country where there is an uncorrupted and relatively decent and fair and honest court system, that's something so many people take for granted. But it's something you really appreciate when someone does you wrong and then you're able to go to court and actually get redress. Sure, it could take years. It costs a lot of money. There's problems with it. The court systems are not perfect, but still far superior to having no court system at all or to having a totally corrupt court system, which is paid off by the people who have done you wrong. What else government has done for you? It prevents torture and cruel and unusual punishment. Now, people say, oh, Leo, but government does do torture and cruel and unusual punishment. To some degree, but generally, a first world democracy is going to protect you against those things. And of course, the court system as well. It prevents child labor as well. Provides you with police and firefighters who you can rely on and trust, who are not corrupted or paid off. Provides riot control. What happens when a riot breaks out and there's no one to control it? That riot could kill you and your family, could rape you and your family. Provides you with criminal investigation, prosecution of various kinds of criminals, not only hard criminals, but also con artists and other kinds of white-collar crime, which is equally as damaging. Provides prisons for serious criminals who otherwise would be running around loose. Provides search and rescue, the Coast Guard. If you're off on a boat somewhere and you get lost in a storm, the government will come and save your ass in many cases. Natural disaster relief for earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, and floods. And we're seeing this more and more with our climate change problems. Emergency health care. If you cut off your hand, you can run to the emergency room and they'll sew it back on. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, the electric grid, sewage systems. Most people don't appreciate what it's like to live without a sewage system. See, all of these things we take for granted. Farming subsidies, which prevent famines. You know, famines used to be a common thing. In first world democracies, there's no such thing as famine anymore. Even if you're poor, for the most part, you still have access to food. Government provides you with poverty relief in case you go broke. It's not perfect by any means, but still, there's some kind of safety net there. Provides you with public education universities. What people don't realize is that without government, the way that it was a couple hundred years ago, the majority of people in society are illiterate and completely ignorant and uneducated. This lowers the whole standard of living of the entire society. So public education and universities is a huge service that government offers. Government offers grants, loans, and subsidies. Government creates national parks which are protected from lodging and from trash and other sorts of privatization interests. The post office, minority rights. Most people don't appreciate that minority rights are not going to be enforced without a government. Without a government, it's majority rule. Whoever is the most powerful will dominate and destroy all minorities out of racist hatred or ethnocentric preferences or cultural and religious preferences. Minorities get wiped out. Government provides vaccines and disease prevention from pandemics and so forth. And it provides research and development to create new vaccines and cures. Building codes, so your buildings don't collapse. build to high quality standards. Government provides insurance, unemployment insurance, flood insurance, retirement insurance like Social Security, disability insurance. Many of these things are non-existent without government. Government provides food regulations and meat inspections. Most people don't realize how dirty meat is unless it's inspected by the government. Entire books have been written centuries ago about how terrible the meat industry was in America, for example, just 100 years ago, before there was a massive movement to get the government to crack down and to do meat inspections, because there was feces in the meat, because a business, is just cutting costs, trying to maximize profits. So of course they don't need to keep a clean butchering table when they're butchering animals, because that cuts down on their profits, to have to clean stuff. Restaurants, kitchens, they don't need to be clean unless the government demands that they're clean. And then people get sick and died from that. Government provides pollution regulation, banking regulation, currency enforcement, market protection when markets take a downturn, when there's a depression. Governments allow satellites, allocation of radio bandwidth, R&D funding for science, technology, and new drugs, space exploration, historical preservation of fossils and artifacts that otherwise would be gobbled up by private collectors and kept in their mansions. And then historical sites would be desecrated. Can you imagine, for example, if some corporation bought the Great Pyramids of Egypt, if that wasn't controlled by the Egyptian government, but it was run by some shady corporation, what that would turn into? They would just sell off the whole pyramid brick by brick to the highest bidder. Government provides accountability for business, antitrust regulations. Government collects and shares statistical data in an objective way. Government offers peace treaties, arms treaties, and diplomacy that otherwise would not be possible. Government looks after foster homes and adoption services. Could you imagine if foster homes and adoption services were private businesses that were run for profit? How terrible that would be. As terrible as they are already, just try to imagine how terrible they would be if they were run for profit by some giant corporation. Literally, children would be sold off for money. It offers prevention of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Can you imagine if private corporations were able to build and develop their own nuclear weapons? What would happen? There would be no life on this planet. And it offers certification, accreditation for various doctors, lawyers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and pharmacists, and various kinds of legal professions, which ensures high quality standards. So all of that government does for you. So don't tell me that government doesn't do anything for you. Now, of course, a libertarian comes in here and says, oh, Leo, but all of these things, the private sector can do just as well. We don't need the government for the post office because we can have FedEx and UPS. And, we don't need government to provide vaccines. The business community will just do it. And space exploration, we have SpaceX. They're doing a better job than NASA. This is fantasy. The private sector cannot fulfill all these functions. Of course, yes, some functions the private sector can fulfill, and it can supplement government. But many of these things the private sector cannot do. Specifically, what this private sector cannot do is it cannot insure you against enslavement. It cannot provide a fair court system for adjudicating disputes. Because if the private sector was controlling these things, it would be for profit. You pay the right person the right amount of money, and they will rule in your favor, or they will enslave whoever you want, or allow you to enslave whoever you want while they look the other way. This is how it works in many underdeveloped third world countries. Their police and their courts are so corrupt that the way to do business is just to bribe. And the person with the most money gets to bribe whoever they want and get away with anything. That's how it works. This is the reality of human nature. You have to understand that human nature is utterly vicious. It doesn't follow any moral norms. It has to be enforced by somebody. These moral norms can't even be taught because there's not schools to teach in without a government. You understand? And what libertarians don't understand is that if given the chance to do so, the private sector would enslave you. The largest corporation will arise and amass so much power that it will be in its financial best interest to enslave all of its employees and all the other smaller corporations, which it can buy up and make part of itself, until this one corporation ends up taking over the entire region and becomes a sort of pseudo-government. Except the problem will be that you're not going to have a vote in this corporation. This corporation is not going to have any kind of Bill of Rights or a constitution. It's not going to be held accountable by any kind of court system. There's not going to be any representation. It's just going to be that one guy who owns all the stock of the corporation. He's going to become the pseudo-corporate dictator. And if you think that a corporation would not enslave you if given the chance, you really underestimate the motivations of corporations. They will certainly enslave you if given the chance. They will develop nuclear weapons. They will develop their own armies. They will buy off whoever they want. They will overpower whoever they want. They will buy up as many smaller corporations as they can until they have monopolized everything. So watch out how much credit you give to corporations. You really need to appreciate how vicious human nature is. There is no such thing as the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle has to be enforced with aggression. That's what government is about. Ta-da! That's what we're talking about here. That's why it's so important. That's why people take it so seriously and get so ideological about it, because it is a matter of life and death. There are many problems with the spiral dynamic stage orange worldview and its politics. Go check out my episode, Spiral Dynamic Stage Orange. That's perhaps the most important one for you to watch and to understand for our purposes here. Because most people who follow me are at a spiral dynamic stage orange level of psychological and cognitive and moral and spiritual development, which is not a very high level. And this level is characterized by some specific political misunderstanding, which I want to just list off for you here. First of all, people who are stuck in stage orange, these tend to be the libertarian types, the individualists who are for freedom and no government. The problem is that they turn freedom into an ideology, into an absolute good, without really understanding the limitations of freedom and what freedom really means. We'll go into that in a minute. Another problem is that they have a fantasy of free markets. They think that if we just let the free markets do whatever they need to do, that everything will just work out fine. This is not going to work. I've already explained various examples why it doesn't work. If you truly allow a free market, what happens is enslavement, not a healthy, well-functioning economy. And really, we don't have free markets anyways. We never had and we never will. There's no such thing as free markets. There's always somebody manipulating the market, controlling it from one side or another. It ain't ever free. And these so-called free markets are always propped up by physical violence and aggression. See? So it's a power play. It ain't free at all. This is a libertarian fantasy. The notion that you can privatize everything to make it good is absurd. Privatizing the national parks is not going to make them better. It's going to make them worse. And it's going to lead to various kinds of corporate exploitation. Because the problem with corporations is that their only function and their only motivation, at least right now, at the level of development that these corporations are at, is exploit everything, monopolize everything to maximize profit at all costs. Damn the environment, damn the people, damn the impact on anybody else. This is a problem. So that needs to be kept in check. And the problem is that these corporations are not accountable to anyone except their stockholders. which are usually a select few number of people, not the majority. So in a sense, if a corporation becomes too powerful, it ends up being anti-democratic because this corporation has so much power that it actually becomes more powerful than the government. And yet most citizens who are under the influence of its power don't have any say in what the corporation does or decides. Whereas with a good government, a first world democracy, you do have some say. That is an important distinction that is lost on many libertarians. These stage orange libertarians also subscribe to a fantasy of individualism. This idea that you are an individual, everyone's an individual, they're just responsible for themselves. There is no collectivism. We're not part of a community. And, leave me alone, Leo. I'm just going to do my thing and you can do your thing. And this is how we're going to live. This is a fantasy, a pure fantasy. It has never worked this way. Human beings, even when we were pre-humans, when we were Neanderthals or earlier hominids and chimp-like creatures, we lived in troops. We were communal. You were never individualistic. It's impossible to survive in life as a chimp or as an ape of some kind, as an individual. You just don't find it. This is a fantasy. And in fact, the only reason you can sit here and extol the virtues of individualism and talk about how we're all individuals and you can just go off and live by yourself and nobody bother you, this is a modern luxury that is only possible thanks to government, thanks to millennia of evolution of government and all these infrastructures that have been built and for which was paid a lot of blood and tears and suffering to allow you to sit here and to talk about how we're all individuals. You're kidding yourself. You're not really an individual. You're part of a collective. You're both. I'm not saying you're only a collective. You are part of a collective, but you're also an individual. That paradox needs to be held at the same time. Very important. Some people get too much hung up on one or the other without seeing that there's a balance that's happening there, a very complicated and nuanced balance. Humans are like ants or termites in a termite colony. No individual ant can survive by himself. It's impossible. So get rid of this fantasy that you were some individual ant. You're not an individual ant. You're part of the entire colony. Get used to it. You'll learn that as you evolve up the spiral. My back is itching. Another problem with the stage orange level of politics is that it doesn't see any collective problems. It thinks all problems are just a problem of personal responsibility. And that if that person just took more responsibility for his life or her life, then that would solve the problem. There's also this sort of sense of entitlement that winners and losers both deserve what they get. So those of us who do well in the economy, we deserve it. And those of us who do terribly, well, we deserve it too, because we're not working hard enough. This ignores the systemic problems that are really at work and the various kinds of manipulations that humans do in order to ensure that they win and that others lose. This is ignored by libertarians. And the extent to which people will rig the system in their own favor. The stage orange people also generally are just about maximizing profits and growing the economy as much as possible, never-ending growth, assuming that this will solve all of our problems, when in fact our problems are way deeper than that, and they will never get solved no matter how much economic growth we experience. And in fact, the more the economy grows, while ignoring the real problems, the worse those problems become, because we're ignoring a deeper cancer. These stage orange people tend to be unlimited materialists. Life for them is a material exercise, and they have a philosophy of materialism, scientism, and generally they're anti-spiritual. Anything spiritual sounds new agey and woo-woo to them, or it sounds theocratic and religious, and all of this is to be done away with, and their ideal society is just like a hyper-rational, hyper-materialist, hyper-scientific society. This, of course, tends to pair with a sort of toxic masculinity, this idea that men and masculinity is the way that society should be run. And that femininity, this is kind of a weak way to structure society. And that society is weakened when women come into positions of power or when feminine values are offered to men, that this somehow weakens the man, these feminine values, when nothing could be further from the truth. It's a sort of a philosophy of me, my own survival at all costs. It's survival of the fittest. That's the stage orange philosophy. Many of our businesses, Wall Street, Fortune 500 companies, CEOs, they subscribe to this sort of philosophy. They think that it's survival of the fittest, and I'm just going to get as much as I can for myself. Damn the environment. Damn what happens to other people. Who cares about my employees? I don't care about their suffering. It's just as long as I get what I want, I get my millions and billions, then everything will be fine. Leo, what's the problem? Once I have my millions and billions, I can hire private security. I can buy my own property, my own houses. I can defend it all. Everything's fine. I don't need to worry about the environment because I'll just get myself clean water and I'll just live in an unpolluted area. It's this sort of mentality. It's a very myopic, selfish mentality. And it takes for granted courts and bureaucracy. These are thought to be bad. Bureaucracy, Leo, bureaucracy, that's bad. We don't want bureaucracy. Actually, what you want is more bureaucracy. You want high quality bureaucracy. That's one of the key things that differentiates a first world country from a third world country, is the quality of their bureaucracy and the quality of their courts. But we'll get to that a little bit later. So now let's go to the very fundamental question. I've tried to address a lot of objections here because we can't even have this discussion without having spent an hour talking about all these traps and problems and incorrect ways of thinking. So now finally, after an hour of introduction, we can talk about what is government? Why does it really exist? So for this, we need to really go back into the history books and take a look at how human society evolved and developed. Here's a simplistic little version of why government exists. So, government is a human invention. It doesn't exist unless humans invent it. Agreed? Is this obvious enough to you? I hope so, because there's no government, for example, within a chimp society. So, 1,000,000 years ago, there was no government. And even 100,000 years ago, government was very, very limited. Government really started to arise only when mankind was able to settle down thanks to developments in agriculture and to accumulate resources in one area. Because before that, if you look at the animal kingdom, animals, take a look at giraffes, lions, polar bears, dragonflies, mice, whatever. They're not able to accumulate large stashes of resources. See? Mostly what they do is that every day they have to go out and find food for themselves, and they can only find as much food as they can carry, and that food could last them maybe a few days, maybe a week, maybe a month at most, and then they got to go out and find more. They can't just a lion can't just build up a horde of 100,000 antelopes that he just has for himself, in his den. He has to go out every day and hunt for them. Otherwise, he starves and he dies. So you might say, well, so what? What's the big deal? It's a very big deal when a species comes to the point where they're actually able to accumulate resources. So when mankind stops just running around and hunting buffaloes and being nomadic, but when mankind acquires cultivated animals who can be stationary, who he can milk and farm and so forth, and get food from, and when he can plant wheat and other crops and grow his own food, now he can acquire stashes of grain, tons of grain, which become valuable. And so here's the real problem of government. In the animal kingdom, there are no rules. Notice that it's extremely brutal and selfish. Anything that you can do in the animal kingdom to assure your own survival is fair play. And that's how animals play. And if you notice, animals tend to be very deceptive. They're very sneaky. Nature is very sneaky because when it comes to survival, it's a matter of life and death. And there are no moral qualms about what it takes to survive. If you got to eat somebody, you eat them. If you got to fool somebody, you fool them. If you have to camouflage yourself and then, like a rattlesnake, bite someone in the neck from a camouflage position, bite a rabbit or whatever as he's passing you by, you do it. You do it. If you got to cannibalize your own children to survive, you do it. That's how nature works. It's extremely brutal. We as humans today, we find ourselves in a very cushy position where we are protected from this brutality. And that's thanks to government. And that's why government arose. Is because what happened was that as these resources got accumulated, there were many small tribes. Remember, humans were never individualistic. We always lived in tribes. 50 people, 100 people, 200 people, whatever it was, doesn't matter. But it was a tribe, and within that tribe, there was a form of pseudo-government. There was a sort of structure. There was no individualism. When you're living in a tribe, you're at spiral dynamic stage purple. You don't even have a sense of self or personal autonomy or individuality. You are living for that tribe. You are like an ant in an ant colony. So keep this in mind, you libertarians. Make sure you get your human development right. So we have these different tribes, and these tribes start to accumulate resources, grain, various metal objects that they work, plates, pots, houses. They develop families, children, wives, all of this, farmlands, herd animals, sheep and cows and all this sort of stuff. Skins and pelts and furs and all this, various kinds of tools, weapons. And now there's an interesting development. One tribe gets the crazy idea that, hey, instead of growing my own crops and herding my own animals and collecting food every day, that's a lot of work. Why don't I just go to the neighboring tribe, which is completely defenseless, has no perimeter, has no border, has no weapons, because all they do is they're just peacefully farming, and let me just conquer them and steal all their stuff. And while I'm at it, I'll rape their women too, and I'll enslave their children, and then they can work for me, and not only do I get to conquer them, but I get to enslave them such that they work for me and do all the work for the rest of my life. Brilliant. Perfect. This is the perfect survival strategy. So of course I make some weapons and I go do it. But what's the problem with this survival strategy? It works in the short term, but it doesn't work in the long term because there's a lot of tribes around the entire earth. There's hundreds, there's thousands, there's hundreds of thousands of different tribes. And there's always, under this situation, a stronger tribe. So while you or I might go and conquer those defenseless, weak people over there, we might do that. But then 10 years later, some stronger tribe comes and conquers and enslaves us and rapes all our wives. Do we like that? No, we don't like that. And then see that stronger tribe, even when it conquers us, some even stronger tribe will come and conquer them and enslave them. So what happens is that we see the rise of the classical Greek and Roman sort of city-state all throughout the Mediterranean and other parts around the world. We see societies as city-states, not countries, but city-states, which means it's a city with a walled perimeter, a very thick, high wall, and that wall is the only thing that protects that city and those citizens from being butchered. People don't appreciate this. You know what the standard was in the Mediterranean area with these city-states around 2,500 years ago? Here was the standard operating procedure. If your city got attacked and your wall was penetrated and your city was conquered, the standard rule was that all of the men in your city would be slaughtered, all of the women would be raped, and the women and the children would be enslaved. That was the rule. That was the whole point of conquering other cities, which is why you see they build these massive walls, because that wall is the only thing that's keeping you from getting raped and enslaved or your throat slit. That's human nature. That right there, I want you to understand that that is freedom. That is freedom. That is how freedom works. It's gang warfare. The most powerful ends up conquering everybody else, and it's a situation which is quite nasty and brutal, and humans don't like it. So what we looked for is we looked for systems that were less brutal. How do we mollify these extremes of violence and conquering and enslaving and thieving and stealing and raping and all of this? How do we prevent that? By creating a government. First and foremost, the government was created simply as a means of defense against enslavement. That's literally what it was. And our early governments were quite brutal themselves, because what they were protecting us from was a greater brutality of enslavement, murder, and rape and genocide. So we could tolerate a little bit of cruelty towards our own citizens as long as it protects us against the greater cruelty of what our enemies and other tribes and foreigners will do to us if we don't unify together. You see, we were forced to unify. It was an arms race. If you didn't unify, you were murdered, enslaved, and raped. That was your reality. There was no option to say, oh, well, wait a minute, guys, but what about the non-aggression principle? What about morals? What about being nice and kind? Isn't slavery and rape wrong? Don't you realize that? It doesn't matter. They'll enslave and rape you anyways. There is no non-aggression principle at this point. There is no moral standards at this point. They weren't evolved or developed yet. This is the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom is freedom. This is what freedom means. And this notion of freedom is extremely important for us to explain in a bit more detail, because so many people misunderstand freedom, and it leads to a lot of confusion within our politics. Freedom is not an absolute good, you have to understand, from the human perspective. Freedom has deep complexity to it, and it tends to be very counterintuitive and fold in on itself. So here's what true freedom means. True freedom means that I'm allowed to do whatever I want, and you are allowed to do whatever you want, and there are no rules. That's true freedom. That means if I like your wife, I can rape her. If I like your daughter, I can slit your throat in the middle of the night, and I can take her for myself, and I can make her my slave, and she'll be feeding me grapes at gunpoint for the rest of her life. That's freedom. You libertarians out there, understand that what freedom means. People get this idea that, oh, freedom is all good and it's all rainbows and butterflies. If only we had more freedom. No. Freedom is something you need protection against. You're way too weak, and you care about your own petty little comforts in life too much to tolerate true freedom. So we, collectively as a species, what we did, the freedom was so brutal that we had to find systems to mollify it. And therefore, we accept limitation. In a sense, government is about reducing absolute freedom for the purpose of fairness and peace. So we accept certain limitations so that we can avoid getting enslaved and raped and thieved and murdered and scammed and all those other things. We need somebody to adjudicate these for us. We need to lay down some common rules that we can all agree upon, that we can act on, so that we can just live a peaceful life and just go about our daily business and just walk down the street without getting raped. That's the reality. But how do you get millions of people with different backgrounds, ethnicities, religions, languages, and worldviews and values and levels of development and consciousness? How do you unify all of those people to agree on a common set of rules about what is right and what is wrong. You might think, oh, well, it's obvious, it's easy. You know, people know that it's wrong to kill. No, they don't. No, they don't. People know that it's wrong to rape. No, they don't. People know that it's wrong to scam people. No, they don't. That's the whole problem. If they knew all those things, if people were just well behaved, then you're right. We could live in libertarian fantasy and we wouldn't need any strong government or military or any of these things. But that's not real life. That's fantasy. I'm talking about real life. In real life, when you give people freedom, total freedom, they enslave, murder, and rape you. And they steal from you. That's what they do because that's survival. Survival is fucking brutal. It doesn't care about being good. It doesn't care about being moral. It doesn't care about being fair. It doesn't care about equality. It only cares about life, its own life. It doesn't care about other life. It only cares about its own life. It only cares about its own people, its family, its friends, maybe its tribe, maybe its religion, but nobody else outside of that. All foreigners are disposable. All minorities are disposable. Anyone who's not like me is disposable. Anyone with a different skin color is disposable. Anyone with a different gender is disposable. This is how low consciousness people live. This is how they think. How do you solve this problem? This is a very serious problem. I want you to understand the depth of the problem that government solves. It's amazing that it even worked at all. This is, as humans, this is our most remarkable technology, and we don't even think of it as a technology. So freedom is counterintuitive. You think maximum freedom would be great, but actually it ends up being very harmful. So we have to limit it. But of course, if you limit freedom too much, then it also becomes a sort of oppression, and it kind of goes full circle, and it turns into its own form of enslavement as well. So there has to be a very careful dynamic balance between the two. Also, I want you to notice, freedom is counterintuitive in the following way. At first, it seems like we have to give up our freedoms in order to prevent ourselves from being attacked and enslaved by neighboring tribes. And it might seem like that's a downer. It's like, oh man, I have to give up my freedoms, my individualism, in order just to not be raped and killed and all that. And it might seem like that's a downside, but actually, it goes deeper than this. Yes, you give up certain freedoms, but then as government allows us to unify, together, we're able to be more than the sum of our parts. We're able to coordinate in collective ways. We're able to build things that we couldn't build by ourselves. What 1 million unified people could do and build is very different than what 100 unified people can do and build. 1 million people can build something much greater than what 100 people can build. And so in a certain sense, what happens is that we build stuff, we build up infrastructure, and that infrastructure then ends up increasing our freedom. So for example, 2,000 years ago, you didn't have the freedom to fly around the world because there were no airplanes, there were no airports, there was no electricity, there was no government that enabled these things. And if you think that you can have airports and electricity and airplanes and global travel from one country to the next effortlessly the way that we can today, where you can just kind of go on Priceline.com and you can just buy a ticket for $500, for $1,000 and fly halfway around the world in the next 24 hours. If you think that that would be possible without modern governments, you're completely deluding yourself. All of that is enabled by modern governments, modern infrastructure, you see. So yes, you had to give up some freedoms. Your ancestor had to give up some freedoms 2,000 years ago, but that was the cost that was paid to ensure that now we have all sorts of amazing freedoms like the internet, YouTube, social media, amazing food from all around the world available in any supermarket. You didn't have this a couple thousand years ago. Airplane travel, cars, and just like I could spend an hour listing all these different freedoms that now we have. We can go into outer space even, which would totally not be possible without government, without infrastructure. Don't think of it simplistically like, oh, well, but SpaceX, Leo, SpaceX is a private company and it can build a rocket better than the government. This is so superficial. You have to understand that SpaceX is standing on the shoulders of giants. You can't have a SpaceX without first having a stable government and without having NASA and other government programs that paved the way for what SpaceX was able to do. So yes, of course, now SpaceX and other private industry will colonize space, and that's great. But you have to understand why that's possible. The freedom that SpaceX has comes only on the shoulders of giants that came before it. See? This is very important to understand and appreciate. It's also important to understand that there are trade-offs between individualism and collectivism. It's not that individualism is best or collectivism is best. This is a false dichotomy. The reality is that these need to be dynamically balanced all the time within society. We need to, at the same time, allow people to have individual rights and freedoms and autonomy, but also realize that these individuals are not really individuals, but they're part of a larger collective, and that there are certain benefits that we get from being a collective. In fact, mankind's greatest strength as a species, we're the most powerful species on this planet because we're able to form cohesive, ordered collectives on a massive scale like no other species is able to do. You can have a small herd of antelope, you can have a school of fish, but what? It's like a couple hundred, a couple thousand fish in a school at most. Maybe you have a flock of birds that has a couple thousand birds in it, but there's no serious organization there, so they're not able to do anything really interesting. So really, these animals are just restricted to very basic things like shelter, food, and a couple of other basic things. They're not able to do anything interesting, and therefore they are very limited. You might say a bird is very free. Yes, a bird is free in the sense that it doesn't have a government controlling it. But notice also how limited the bird is. It's not free in the sense that all it does is shits and eats and has sex, and that's all it can do. And it can't cure its own diseases. It can't build nice shelters for itself. It can't educate itself. They're so limited. See? So we as a species, because we're more intelligent, we're more capable, we need that collectivism. We need to form a community. Not only are we forming a community because it serves us individually, but also it's something that feels good. Being part of a community gives you a sense of larger purpose, which a lot of people at Stage Orange overlook the importance of. Community. Community is not an evil. Now, there are problems with taking collectivism too far. Certainly there are problems. It needs to be delicately balanced. But there's an even deeper point here, which many people don't understand at all, which is that society is a whole-on and human beings are whole-ons. What is this? A whole-on. A whole-on is a whole topic that I'll have an episode on in the future. But a whole-on means that it's a part and a whole simultaneously. So for example, my hand is a whole-on. What that means is that it's a whole in that it can do whatever a hand does, and we can call it a hand, and we can understand that it's a whole. You know, a hand is like an individual unit. But also it's made up of little cells and molecules and muscles and bones and tendons, and each of those are parts of the whole. So in this way, the hand is made up of smaller things. But also the hand itself is a smaller part of my entire body. And the hand itself doesn't have any power or ability unless it's part of my heart and my brain. It's all interconnected, my whole nervous system and all this. You know, the hand needs the teeth because without the teeth, I can't eat food and I can't generate the calories that are necessary to power this hand. So you see how it's deeply interconnected this way. Likewise, the hand can't be a hand unless it has all the parts that it needs. It needs the bones, it needs the veins, it needs the blood, it needs the molecules that are making up this hand. So here is the problem that people fall into. They don't recognize that human beings are also holons. We are not the highest unit. There is a society above us. So the way that nature works is that there are holons within holons within holons within holons, all the way up and all the way down. But we humans tend to be so arrogant that we think that all of this is just for us and that this is just all for my personal individual ego. And then we forget that we're part of this larger collective. We're part of a communion. We're part of society, which is its own holon. And so the trick with these holons is that there's always a delicate balance that needs to be struck between the autonomy of an individual part versus the communion that that part takes part in of some larger holon. So for example, for my hand to function, my hand cannot have a will of its own. It needs to be subject to the communion of the larger unit that it's a part of. You know, because if my hand had its own desires and ideas, it would start doing whatever it wants, right? This would be a problem because the hand then is not serving me, the higher unit that it's designed to serve. So the hand needs to know its place within the whole scheme. Otherwise, it becomes pathological and dysfunctional. So this is what happens with a lot of libertarians and stage orange people, is that they are like the hand which forgets that it's part of something larger. And so they act like individuals, swinging their pendulum all the way to this end towards 100% freedom and autonomy without recognizing that it's not just about autonomy, it's about communion as well. You don't just want 100% individualism and autonomy, you want some measure of communion, but also you don't want too much communion to the point where you just become like the Borg collective and your own individuality is completely wiped out. So what you have to understand is that when we're talking about government and society, there's more going on than just a bunch of individuals. At each level of reality, when you get a bunch of little parts together, combine them together, it's more than the sum of its parts. So reductionism doesn't work. We can't just reduce the hand to a bunch of atoms, even though it is a bunch of atoms. But we can't just reduce it to that because the hand has its own unique functions that atoms do not have. It has emergent qualities. Likewise, societies and governments and groups of people and communities have their own emergent properties. So government is not only responsible for regulating individuals and creating a great life for individuals, government is also responsible for regulating groups of individuals, because within a society you have subgroups. You have religious denominations, you have political parties and factions, you have cults, you have corporations and businesses, you have clubs, you have sports teams, you have all of this stuff that I talked about in my episode about collective ego. And so society needs to not only deal with individual egos, but also collective egos, which adds an additional layer of complexity to this entire thing. Of course, on top of all that, society as a whole is one giant collective ego, which is more than the sum of its parts. So this is very tricky, as you can see. This is very complicated now. And you can see that the way that we discuss politics, none of this is taken into account usually. Usually all that it is it's just one individual or one lobbyist group, special interest group, trying to look out for its own individual interests without caring about the interests of anybody else in society. And this creates a sort of myopia, this sort of stage orange myopia, which creates for a very dysfunctional society. And in a nutshell, we can boil all this down to simply blind selfishness, or what I call devilry. When you're acting out of blind selfishness without any concern for your impact on your environment or others around you, or what it means for society as a whole, you're being a devil. And you can expect the kind of results that a devil gets. You can expect a lot of evil, corruption, and all sorts of other problems, including, of course, suffering, which is why we're talking about this whole topic, is to reduce suffering. That's our whole goal here. Fundamentally, what reality is doing on a metaphysical level is that it's dividing itself, and then it's figuring out ways to reunite with itself. And it's doing this over and over and over and over again at all levels of reality. From molecules to cells to individual humans to societies to countries. This is what's happening. Division is problematic because every boundary that's created needs to be enforced and maintained. And these boundaries are always temporary and they can die, which leads to suffering if you get too attached to one of these boundaries. So what mankind has been doing since the beginning of its existence is that it started off as like a unified group of people, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa. Then they all migrated around the world. And by doing that, they divided themselves into various tribes and races and ethnicities over thousands of years. And then eventually these tribes all grew into cities and city-states and countries and all this, and then they started to clash with each other. And because, you know, the populations just got too big, and they started to overwhelm the environment to the point where they started to literally bleed into each other. Every tribe grew so much that it's like a fungus, you know, two funguses just sort of like growing into each other and clashing with each other. To the point where we are in a world now where it's no longer sustainable to stick to one tribe because we're recognizing that we're a global species. See? You can either deny that and resist that, or you can accept it. And if you deny it, then that creates all sorts of serious political problems, violence, war, genocide, and so forth. This happens because people deny that we have divided ourselves and that now the proper thing is to start to unify ourselves. And that this is totally proper and natural. This is just how reality works at a metaphysical level. This is what happens. And then once we unify, we'll divide again. There will be further divisions. For example, when humans start to colonize the moon and Mars and the rest of the solar system, we're going to divide ourselves again. You see, and then after a certain point, once all the planets get populated 100,000 years from now, you know, once Mars is full and the moon is full, then they start to war with each other. Now we have to unify them again. See what's happening? Human political history has a definite arc to it. I want you to notice this arc. What this arc is ultimately doing is it's leading towards greater equality in consciousness. Less brutality, less oppression, less enslavement. Greater complexity, greater freedom, because remember, by building up infrastructure and complexity, we're actually able to do new things that could not be done before, like space travel. There cannot be space travel without governments. And it's leading to greater unity in the long run, the very long run. Of course, it's not perfectly linear. There's always ups and downs. So, you know, you could be living through an era or a century where there's a lot of disunity, there's a lot of war, there's a lot of violence. But then after that passes, there will be a higher level of complexity, more fairness, more equality, and less suffering, and then more unity. And then that will also, you know, oscillate and go up and down and back and forth. So what is politics and government really about? First and foremost, it's about survival. Individual and collective survival. And there's no such thing as survival in the abstract or survival as a universal for everybody. Survival is relative to your identity. Whatever you identify as is the thing that needs to be survived. So what do you identify as being? A Christian, a Muslim, a Jew, an atheist, a man, a woman, French, German, Japanese, American, Native American, African American, rich, poor, upper class, middle class, lower class, gay, straight, transsexual, bisexual. Identity plays a huge part in politics. It's central. It's central. It's not just that the left plays identity politics. Everybody is playing identity politics all the time. That's what politics is about. And not only is it individual identity, it's collective identity. You know, do you identify as a hippie, as a punk, as a socialist, a communist, a capitalist, as an American? These are all collective identities, you see. People get attached to their collective identity just as much as they do to their individual identity. These things are fused together. And so this is why politics gets so heated and gets so emotional and it gets so irrational and it gets so unconscious, is because people are generally not conscious of the fact that identity is the thing that's being survived, because they haven't done this work that we've been doing with Actualized.org. They don't understand what an ego is or what a collective ego is. They're just blindly acting out on selfishness. That's what low consciousness means. You're not conscious of your selfishness. You're not conscious of the selfishness of your tribe or of your collective. So many Americans are not conscious of how America as a whole is extremely selfish as a nation. Neither are African Americans or Jews or Muslims. See? So I'm not picking on any one particular group here. This is a rampant problem for 99% of people. Nobody is immune to this stuff. And it's extremely tricky. So what is politics and government really about? It's about moderating between different competing survival agendas, regulating this selfishness so that people are selfish, but not in extreme ways. Because if it's too extreme, it's not pleasant for anybody. And in fact, selfishness itself becomes its own worst enemy. It's karma. You might think that, well, but Leo, but being super selfish, what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is it comes back around. What's wrong with going and raping your neighbor's wife? What's wrong is that then he comes back and does it to your wife. See, if you could just go do that and get away with it without any repercussions, then there wouldn't be anything wrong with it, per se. You could have moral objections, but I mean, just like pragmatically, there'd be nothing wrong with it. But in practice, there's a big problem because it's tit for tat. You do something nasty to somebody else, they do it back to you. Have you noticed how this works in relationships? A relationship needs to be rather even, where one side is not so selfish that it's taking everything and dominating the other side, because that ends up being unsustainable. Because this side, the one that's getting dominated and oppressed, builds a resentment. And what ends up happening is that it gets so resentful that it takes a knife in the middle of the night and cuts the other guy's dick off. That's what happens. That's reality, right? So we need to come to a sort of truce, and we can say, okay, look, I won't cut your dick off, you won't cut my dick off, and we'll live peacefully, okay? Can we agree to that? And of course, you know, some people agree to it, and some people still don't agree to it, because they think that I can get away with it. I'll cut off his dick, but he won't cut off mine, because I'll have an army behind me. See, it's sort of... But then that doesn't last, because there's always a bigger army. And then also, you're always living in fear that someone's going to cut your dick off. Even if you have a giant army, still, when that tyrant or dictator is sleeping at night, he's still having dreams and nightmares about getting his dick cut off. So what is politics about? It's about distribution of power and resources. This very silly idea that's thrown around in the media that, oh, these socialists are for redistribution of wealth, and that this is a bad thing. All government and politics is about redistribution of power and resources. That's the whole game. It's a giant negotiation. We're sitting at a negotiation table and we're trying to decide who has too much power and too many resources. And the way that most people play the game, because they're so selfish, is that their strategy is simply to maximize their own power and resources. They don't care about fairness or equality. So even if I already have more power than everybody else, more money than everybody else, If I'm a stage orange typical CEO or corporate person, I don't care. I need more. I need more power. I need even more resources because it's not enough that I have billions. I need trillions because I have enemies out there. Leo, if I don't do it, some other company will do it. So I got to do it. That's their thinking. It's all about redistribution of power and resources. What do you think lobbying is about? Every single major corporation in America, and really all around the world, lobbies their government. Why? So that the rules of the game can be rigged in such a way that resources are redistributed to them rather than their competitors. That's business. That's life. That's survival. A company can't not do this. If it's not doing this, it doesn't survive. But also, this produces a lot of collateral damage. There are worse and better ways to go about it. There are pathological ways and there are healthy ways to go about it. There are unecological ways and there are environmentally friendly and ecological ways to go about it. There are unconscious ways and conscious ways to go about it. Politics is about reduction of brutality and oppression. At least that's what it should be about. That's what it is in the long term. It's about creating a fair playing field for people. It's about building infrastructure and systems that increase freedom and allow for greater complexity and more interesting things to be done by all the citizens of the society. It's about community. It's not just about utility and pragmatism. It's also about a sense of community. You can participate with others in a festival, carnival, or a football game, or singing the national anthem, or pledging allegiance to the flag, or participating in some sort of large-scale religious gathering. You know, these are all communities, and we get satisfaction from being part of a community. Politics and government is about evolution and about emergence of higher holons. So don't you dare think that evolution ends with man. We are just a tiny speck, a little particle of something much larger that is emerging and happening. And really everything that society is doing as it's evolving is really beyond our individual control. Evolution is guiding all of it. And evolution is guiding it towards higher levels of organization and higher levels of consciousness. And you need to understand and be humbled by that so that you don't think that you're at the top of the food chain, because you're not. And if you think you are, you're going to behave like a devil, and there's going to be pathology as a result, and lots of suffering. Find your proper place in the universe, is my point. Government is also about creating a consensus amongst millions of people with diverse survival agendas. Of course, with so many people to please, not everyone can be satisfied, but there are some decisions which benefit the majority and which are generally beneficial to most people, which are the ones that we should be caring the most about. Government is about building a consensus between millions of people, which becomes a battle of agendas, which is why we have culture wars, we have policy debates, we have economic manipulation, we have legal battles in the courts, and then we have actual war. What is all of this about? It's about enforcing one's own survival agenda and changing the culture in such a way that it benefits you and your tribe. See? So you might be wondering at this point, Leo, what kind of government or society is the best then? Should it be capitalist or socialist or what? Well, that's the whole point. Who's to say what the best is? The best for whom? You have to understand that this notion of the best is a very simplistic and fallacious notion. There's no such thing. Everything is relative. What's best for your survival is not best for somebody else's survival. And there are no rules that say what we should do. We're making it up as we go along. So how should we make it up? What kind of things will we say are right, and what kind of things will we say are wrong? Because there is no such thing objectively as an absolute. We are defining what is right and what is wrong. And of course, every government on the planet has their own definitions of what is right and what is wrong, if you haven't noticed yet. It's important to understand this. It might seem very basic, but you know, a lot of people get stuck in all these policy debates because they have firm convictions, ideological positions about what they know is right and what they know is wrong. It would be much wiser if we all admitted that we're making it up and that there's no such thing as right and wrong. And that when we say something is right or something is wrong, really what we're doing is we are unconsciously blindly executing our own survival agenda. So usually when people insist that something is right or wrong, really what they're doing is they're just acting out what's right for them, what's good for their survival, without realizing that what's good for them is not necessarily what's good for their neighbor, and that therefore we have these disagreements and wars and so forth. See, so if we want to start to get along together and we really want to unify at higher levels of whole-on organization, we need to start to understand that our notions of right and wrong are relative. Otherwise, we can't do it. And this is why a lot of right-wingers get stuck, because right-wingers tend to have very firm ideological convictions about right and wrong. Now, of course, left-wingers also do, but generally they're a little bit more open to the relativism. To conservatives and right-wingers, relativism is a dirty word. And of course, just by me saying what I just said, already I'm going to be labeled as a leftist, and all the stuff that I said here is going to be dismissed and discounted. But on the other hand, I can't not say what I need to say here. This is conscious politics. The problem is that to a devil, conscious politics is not going to look like conscious politics. To a devil, conscious politics is going to look like evil, because the devil projects his own devilry out onto everybody else so that he can appear to himself to be an angel, because he's blind to his own selfishness. So actually, when I advance conscious politics as a sort of a selfless way of going about politics, trying to transcend the self, those who are the most selfish will view what we're talking about here as the most selfish. This is their defense mechanism. You see? This is how it works. There's another very deep problem that people don't understand about government, which is that government must be inclusive in a way that other organizations don't have to be, which makes government much more difficult to manage and organize. See, government is the highest structure that humans have developed. Unlike, say, a corporation or a religious order or a commune or a club or a gang. These are all smaller subunits of the larger overarching unit of government or country. See? And what this means is that, for example, if I have a spiritual community, let's say I build a hippie commune, and I have people who I invite to come join my commune, but let's say some criminal, some violent, insane, psychopath criminal somehow makes his way into my commune, and after a little while, all of us together, maybe it's 50 of us in this commune, we all recognize that that guy's a troublemaker, he's violent, he's dangerous, he's crazy, we got to kick him out. So we just kick him out, and then everything goes fine. We can do that. A club can do that because there's a larger unit of society which is able to take that person, you see, and that larger unit has mechanisms for dealing with that person. There's a legal system, there's mental health professionals, there's a police, there's insane asylums if he needs to go there, there's prisons if he needs to go there. There's a court system that can try him. There's all these various remedies that exist in larger society, which enables us as a little spiritual community to kick someone like that out. But society as a whole doesn't have that option. What does society or government as a whole do with poor people, disabled people, sick people, insane people, crazy people, deluded people, psychopaths, sociopaths, schizophrenics, religious fanatics, fundamentalists, criminals, terrorists, insurgents? You can't exclude them. Where are you going to put them? Are you going to, what, kick them out of your country to some other country? Well, that other country won't take them. I mean, maybe they will if they were immigrants and they came there illegally. Maybe you could deport them. But for most, in most cases, they're not immigrants. The problem is not immigrants. The problem is your own internal people. What do you do with them? Because every country has their own hordes of poor, sick, mentally ill, insane, crazy people. And I'm not judging these people. I'm just saying that this is a reality. There are some really fringe cases out there which can destabilize your whole society if you don't somehow control them. So what do you do with them? You can't kick them out. And even if you could kick them out, let's say you sent them all to some island in the Caribbean. Well, then you would have an island full of criminals and terrorists and other people, and these people would rally around together and they would form their own government. And then they would come and attack you with their crazy ideas. See? So it's not going to work. So what needs to happen is that you need to integrate them, and you need to create systems and infrastructure for dealing with these common situations. Every country has sick people, mentally ill people, addicts, people who are disabled and non-functional in various ways, people who are just in crippling poverty, or they have mental conditions where they can't maintain a job. What do you do with these people? You can't just say, well, fuck them, who cares? Leo, it's all just every man for himself. You can't say that, because while you are sleeping in your comfy little house with your beautiful wife and your children, one of these sick, mentally deranged, poor people who doesn't have a home, who you just said, oh, fuck him, he's going to crawl into your house and rape your family. You see? So it don't work. Your plan don't work. It's not sustainable. Wouldn't it be better if we found ways to actually solve these problems in a more humane way, where these people got some treatment, they got some help, so that they weren't harm to themselves and to the rest of society? You see, because when you have someone who's dissatisfied with his own life and has nothing to lose, and he feels like he's completely lost and hopeless and he has no chance for success or improvement and that nobody cares about him, this is the type of person that goes into a school and shoots up your children. See? So maybe it's in your own best long-term self-interest to take these fringe cases seriously and not just to say, oh, fuck them, every man for himself, because you're part of a community. See? Likewise, this applies to other governments. We could ask the same question, like, what do we do with the poorest countries, the most dysfunctional countries in the world? Like maybe Afghanistan, certain very underdeveloped countries in Africa, and certain countries in the Middle East. These countries are less developed, and they have some serious pathologies. And you could say, well, who gives a fuck about them? I'm just here in America and I'm comfortable. Everything's good. I don't care about what happens in Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or anywhere else. Yeah. Unless you happen to be working in New York at the World Trade Center on 9/11, and then a plane crashes into your building and you or your family dies as a result of that. Now, all of a sudden, see, now it's no longer, oh, just fuck it. No, now it matters. It matters that there are people in the world who are suffering through enormous hardships and who feel that their life is so miserable, they feel so oppressed that they feel they need to get on an airplane and crash it into a building. See, it matters. So rather than alienating those people, the smarter, wiser thing to do would be to integrate them and to help them. Because happy people don't crash airplanes into buildings. Happy people don't start wars. Happy people don't rape others. Happy people don't thieve and steal and create scams. See? So these sort of isolationist policies where you separate yourself off with a wall from other people, or where you lock others in a jail cell, or you confine them to some bad country that you forget about, this doesn't work. It's like sweeping dirt under the rug. Eventually, you gotta clean it out at some point. Otherwise, it becomes a cancer. What happens if some terrorist cell in Pakistan acquires a nuclear weapon? Can you ignore that? No, because the world is interconnected. And it's not just a bunch of individuals. We're dealing with complex collectives here. Multi-layered collectives. Collectives within collectives within collectives within collectives. So government is uniquely difficult because it has to account for all people. It has to be inclusive. You can't just take the best of the best and sort of start your own personal country club of the richest, most elite, most intelligent, high IQ individuals, because the majority of the people are not high IQ individuals by definition, nor are they elites, nor are they geniuses, nor are they super wealthy billionaires. So if you do start your little billionaire country club, guess what? The rest of the people will gang up and take you over. That's what they'll do, because there's more of them than of you. And if you get too much power and you try to oppress them too much, or you try to be too exclusive, you leave them out of the club, they'll get resentful and they'll hurt you for it. And they'll take away all your money and your freedom, and they will cut your head off in some revolution. So government is so difficult precisely because people have so many different worldviews and perspectives, because there are so many diverse survival agendas that people have. Like I talked about in my episode, Why People Seem Crazy. People literally inhabit different realities, because reality is not an objective, static thing, but it is mind dependent. Your mind is constructing your reality. And so millions and billions of people are constructing their own realities, and now we have to somehow unify them all together. Otherwise, we all slit each other's throats and destroy ourselves through a nuclear holocaust. This is why government is so difficult. It's like herding cats. And you're trying to get everybody to understand what's really going on, but everybody is so goddamn selfish and desperate just to survive, to make ends meet, and to feed their family, and to protect themselves, that they have no interest thinking about philosophy or different perspectives or about systems thinking or about awakening or about spirituality. They don't give a shit about any of that. All they care about is how to pay the bills, how to put food in their children's bellies, how to defend themselves and their home. See, this is the condition we're in. So it's very, very difficult. There are no easy answers here. Government cannot be merely an intellectual exercise. Government is a highly pragmatic endeavor. These issues we're talking about are life and death issues for people. Many of you listening to me, you live in a first world democracy. You have enough money, you have a shelter, you have food, and you're relatively comfortable. Still, you suffer a lot, but you're relatively comfortable. You're not desperate. So for you, you can just sit around and theorize about politics. But there are billions, literally billions of people on this planet right now who are dealing with famine, poverty, oppression, slavery, sex trafficking, addiction, drugs, abusive relationships, exploitation by their bosses and their companies and coworkers, underpay, corporations stealing from them, toxic pollution that's happening in their neighborhoods, oppression, racism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, gang warfare, violence in their neighborhoods. These are life and death issues for these people. And government needs to address serious survival threats. So put away your culture wars and your petty ideologies, because there's real problems that need solving. You'll really appreciate that when your own survival is threatened. That's when all of your ideals will fly out the window. You're only a libertarian as long as your survival hasn't been threatened. As soon as it has, you ain't going to be a libertarian for very long. You're going to bitch and whine and moan, and your survival, your ego is going to kick in, and it's going to get you to do what needs to be done for you to live. Otherwise, you're going to die. And that's how it's been for thousands of years. I also want you to appreciate that no human knows what the best design is for government. Because government is not just something that one person sits down, designs, and controls, but rather government evolves through natural selection and trial and error. The difference is that even though our bodies evolved through natural selection, this was done for us. We didn't have an active, conscious participation in how our bodies evolved. But with government, we do. We get to say how we want to create it and what we think is best. And in this way, we are consciously participating in the evolutionary natural selection process, which is rather cool, but it's also a pretty big responsibility. So how do we create the best government? Here's a thought experiment which will help you to understand how to do this. I want you to imagine that before you're born, you can look down upon the planet, look upon the governments that exist, the different countries, the different people, and you can decide who you're going to incarnate as. You can be born into any country, into any part of the country, as any race, as any profession, as anyone with any kind of talent. You can be a man or a woman or a Muslim or Christian family or whatever you want. You can be born into that. And while you're doing that, you also get to determine what kind of government you want. But there's an additional wrinkle. You're also fully conscious that you will incarnate as everybody else as well. So even though this one time you're going to come down, let's say, as a rich white man living in New York City who's a stockbroker, who's a billionaire, let's say, you pick that one first because that one sounds like the most appealing to you. But there's one very important difference, is that you know that after that one, you're going to incarnate as a poor person in the South. You're going to incarnate as some kid in Africa with AIDS. You're going to incarnate as a heroin drug addict who's homeless on the streets. You're going to incarnate as a gay person, as a trans person, as a black person, as a Muslim, as a Christian, as a fundamentalist, as a Jew, as a Palestinian, as a man, as a woman, as everything that can possibly ever exist. And now you ask yourself, what kind of government would you want? See, that's the kicker right there. Now, all of a sudden, you realize how important it is to have a fair and equal government. Because the thing that keeps people from having an objective sense of fairness is their own selfishness and individual bias. And so what happens is that somebody happens to be born into a rich family, white, male, in New York City, and becomes a stockbroker because his dad was a stockbroker, and he's a billionaire because his dad was a millionaire and gave him millions of dollars to start his stockbrokering business with. You know, that person, his attitude and worldview is such that he never thinks he will be poor. He never thinks that he's going to be a drug addict. He never thinks he's going to be gay or trans or black or a Muslim. He never thinks he's going to grow up in Africa. Never. He never thinks he's going to get cancer or AIDS, or he never thinks he's going to be exploited by some corporation like McDonald's that pays you a slave wage, or he's going to be born and work in some sweatshop in Bangladesh for 18 hours a day as slave labor. He never thinks he's going to be born as a young girl who gets sold into the sex trafficking trade. He never thinks that because he's so locked into his own persona and identity of being this rich white guy that, like, that's all he knows. And in fact, he actively denies and doesn't want to look at all of the other people in the world who are suffering and living through incredible unfairness and brutality. He blocks all that out of his mind because it's very painful to think about these things. Because if he thought about these things, his wealthy New York stockbroker lifestyle could not be maintained. He would have a moral crisis. He would have an existential crisis of consciousness, a spiritual crisis for all the suffering and inequality that's going on around the world. See? But if you know that you're going to incarnate as all of these people, then what do you want? You want a fair government that treats everybody well, that doesn't exploit anybody, that doesn't enslave anybody, that doesn't treat one group over another group, that doesn't favor one religion over another religion. See, this is what Christians, for example, fundamentalist Christians don't understand. They don't understand that they're going to reincarnate as a Muslim. How would you like to live in America as a Muslim if right now you're a Christian? You think you'd like that? You think it's fair? How would you like it if you were born as a black person in the South 300 years ago? If you're a white Southern Christian today, you think you would like that? You think it's fair? See? Very quickly you see how unfair it is. Because the ego, your identity, doesn't care about fairness. It cares about blind selfishness and gaining survival advantage. That's all you care about. So the whole trick with conscious politics is finding a way to step outside of our egoic survival agenda. Only then can we construct a proper government. It's rather like balancing in game design. I used to be a game designer, and if you've played video games, especially certain online games, which are very competitive, you know that bad balancing can destroy a game. If you're playing some World of Warcraft, the paladin and the sorcerer and the elf archer, they need to all be balanced. Now, that doesn't mean they're all equal. They have unique skill sets and strengths and weaknesses and pros and cons, but it needs to be balanced so that they can all play together in a good way. And see, as a game designer, you come to appreciate that. You can't just have one favorite. You can't just say, oh, well, the paladin is the one that I like the most and screw all the rest. I'm just going to make the paladin the most powerful one. You can't do that. That makes you a terrible game designer. You need to be able to step outside of your personal preferences, and you got to say, okay, if I was being objective, how do I equalize all of these so that they can play well together? And then it's a fun game, and nobody is overpowered. Because if one of the classes is the best, objectively the best, then everyone's going to play that class, and that's going to be worse for everybody. Because see, it's healthier for your online game when people are playing the different classes rather than where 90% of your entire player base is only playing the paladin, because then it's boring. Everybody's just a paladin. It's lame. It's much better when you've got your sorcerers and your elves and all that nicely balanced out. It also means that the other person can have some incentive to play through the different roles. They don't just play paladin. Your game will actually get more longevity out of it if the guy can then re-roll his character into an elf, archer, and then a wizard and an orc and so on. It's very much like that with society. Mankind, generally speaking, has not yet discovered the true aim of government. Here it is. The ultimate aim of government should be to elevate consciousness and love. That's the key. The true aim of government is to elevate consciousness and love. This is what everybody ultimately wants. This is the one common thread through all human lives, no matter whether you're living as a rich person, poor person, sick person, disabled person, African person, white person, or whatever. Because this is what life is about, consciousness and love. Government should be about creating a healthy ecosystem for raising the consciousness of all beings as much as possible. That's the ideal. Now, of course, doing that's going to be quite challenging, but still, to know what we're aiming for is very important. Most people and most politicians and most political analysts don't even understand this. They don't even use the words consciousness and love when they're talking about government or politics. It's ridiculous. We're living in the Dark Ages. We are living in barbarous times. Because the word consciousness is not even used within politics. And it's dismissed as some, airy-fairy thing. Consciousness and love, yeah, Leo, right, that's gonna help somebody. You have to understand, we need to know theoretically what the aim is first before we can reach it. See? Because if government is not being designed for the maximization of consciousness and love, what is it being designed for? By default, remember, it's being designed for devilry. It's being designed for materialism, profit, greed, power, fear, hatred, isolationism, ethnic identity, division, theocracy, every man for himself, anarchy, something like that. These are the default things. When you're not designing society for high consciousness and love, you're by default designing it for low consciousness and hatred. It's really that simple. See? And right now, most of our politicians and people think that society needs to be designed towards designed towards materialistic greed. That's what our society is being designed towards right now. And that's why we have so many problems. Now, when I talk about, by the way, spirituality and politics intersecting, don't make the mistake of thinking that what I'm talking about is removing the separation of church and state and creating a theocracy. That's not what I'm talking about. Some of you Christians might get that wrong idea, or some Muslims. No. Remember that there's pre-rational, rational, and post-rational. There's like religious, scientific, and then post-scientific, spiritual. All right, so human consciousness and society evolves through these various stages. So I'm not talking about building a theocracy. I'm talking about a non-ideological form of spirituality, which is the underpinning of all of government and society. Now you can see already the enormous problem here is that many stage orange people balk at this idea that, oh, Leo, you're going to introduce spirituality into government? This is terrible. This is taking a step backwards. We need less spirituality. We need less religion, not more. But then what do you have? You have rampant scientism and materialism and reductionism. That's all you have. Then you have a society built on greed. That's not going to work. We're already doing that. It's producing terrible results. You might wonder, though, but Leo, why consciousness and love? What's so special about these two? Isn't this some sort of just hippie, airy-fairy ideal? Can you really build a real government on consciousness and love? Of course you can. That's what we've been doing all along. It's just that there's many gradations and degrees to consciousness and love. Right now, our consciousness and love is so low that we don't even recognize that what we're doing is elevating consciousness and love. It's happening anyways, because here's the secret. All that evolution is doing is maximizing consciousness and love. That's what evolution is doing as a universal force. This goes way beyond humans. This goes way beyond my own personal hippie, new agey ideas. I'm talking about the entire origin of life and physical existence. Now, for this, you have to really reach some high levels of consciousness, but eventually you awaken so deeply that you realize that all of reality is an infinitely expanding love fractal, of which mankind is one tiny branch. And so when you become conscious of that, that recontextualizes all of politics and government for you. It recontextualizes all of human life. Now you start to see what we need to be doing here on Earth, what this whole life is about, individually and collectively. We can be aligned with the force of evolution, or we can be aligned against it. If we're aligned against it, we're going to go extinct. If we align with it, we're going to create a beautiful society, and amazing things will happen, and we will reduce suffering. The choice is ours. We have this freedom. You might wonder, well, Leo, how is evolution about love and consciousness? This makes no sense, because there was no love or consciousness before humans existed. You're wrong. Love and consciousness was there before the Big Bang happened. That's what you discover with deep awakening. But of course, I don't expect many stage orange people to understand this. So I just want you to see for now that there is an arc, a trajectory to the universe. Something much bigger is going on than what materialists and scientists think. It is not a brute mechanical process of trial and error. That is not what evolution is. There's a lot to say about evolution, which I'll have a separate episode on in the future. So what I'm talking about here is aligning ourselves with the force of the entire universe. And this is what makes what I'm talking about here, conscious politics, very different from traditional politics. Because traditional politics is just about selfishness. It's not about consciousness or love. It's not about helping everybody to raise their consciousness. It's just about helping yourself, helping your tribe, helping your family, getting rich. That's what it's about. Getting favors for yourself. I'm talking about expanding our circle of concern to include the entire universe, all living beings, and then acting from that in an unbiased, objective way to help all beings raise their consciousness and love, not just humans, all beings. This is what happens when you become very conscious. This is a sort of stage turquoise, biodynamic stage turquoise way of looking at government and politics. Politics and government must be grounded in consciousness, because in the end, consciousness is the only thing there is. And consciousness is the ultimate key to solving all problems, because all human problems are the result of either too low of a consciousness or some twisted pathological form of consciousness, which needs to be transcended and awoken out of. Individual consciousness and collective consciousness are deeply interconnected. The structure of society directly impacts how easy it is to raise one's own consciousness, which is why we need to structure society in a way where we have infrastructure that helps people to meet their basic needs, so that then they can spend the rest of their life pursuing the raising of consciousness. By doing this, we're not just helping them, we're helping ourselves. Because the more conscious all of your neighbors are, the better neighbors they will be to you, to your family, the better coworkers they will be, the better, more informed citizens they will be, the better politicians they will elect into office, the better work they will do, the better inventions they will create, the more responsible they will be. See? The less likely they will be to shoot up a school. There's a sort of a vicious cycle here where low consciousness government creates low consciousness citizens, and then low consciousness citizens recreate low consciousness government, and it gets locked into this cycle. On the other hand, we can flip this around, and if we have a high consciousness government, it'll create high consciousness citizens, and then high consciousness citizens will create an even higher consciousness government. The choice is ours, what we do. The fundamental problem with government is that most people use it to self-deal. You see, because government taxes people, a large pool of money is accumulated over which there is quite little oversight. Literally billions and trillions of dollars every year is collected, but then it's very easy for people to leech off of this money, because it's much easier to leech off of taxpayer money than it is to start a legitimate business from scratch, for example, or to do something creative like create some beautiful music or some beautiful art that people like and will pay you for. It's much easier to leech off the system. And so there are entire professions that exist solely to leech off the system. But the mistake that many libertarians make is they say, well, Leo, but this is just proof that government is bad. You know, big government is worse than small government. And so the solution is to reduce government and to eliminate government. Because like Leo, like you said, yeah, it's easy to corrupt and people just leech off this money, this taxation, and this taxation is just theft. This is wrong. The solution is not to reduce government. The solution is to eliminate self-dealing and corruption from government. What you want is not small government. What you want is good, effective, responsible government, which gives you a lot of bang for your buck. Because the reality is that we can't eliminate government. Government is a necessity. Taxation is a necessity. You're not going to eliminate these things. That's a fantasy. So as long as a taxation is happening, what we can do, though, is we can, as citizens with our voting power and our political activism, we can try to get that money used in productive ways, so that rather than wasting trillions of dollars on foreign wars that ends up killing people and just deepening their misery and frustration while not getting us much in return, we can invest that money into infrastructure, better schools, and mental health and training programs, re-education programs that will help to lift people up so that they can then pursue the raising of their consciousness. So the solution is to end the self-dealing. And the way you do that is by becoming more engaged, more aware of what's going on in government so that you can hold it accountable. What's missing is the accountability from you. See, the mistake people make is that they love to blame the politicians without taking their own responsibility for what's going on in government. Those politicians are a direct reflection of our own individual consciousnesses, of your own voting choices, of your own political activism or lack thereof, of your own laziness, of your own ignorance about how politics and government works. The proper way to end government corruption is by being educated and engaged as a voter, not by undermining the government, not by privatizing everything, but by strengthening the government, making it more transparent and accountable to the people. Because if you privatize everything, there's not going to be accountability. Private corporations are not accountable to the people. See, this is the fundamental problem with the libertarian agenda, is that it tries to undermine government with privatization of everything, without realizing that if you do that, you're actually going to end up in a more enslaved situation than you have with the government. Because with the government, at least you get to vote every couple of years. You won't with a corporation. And the corporation ain't going to be looking out for you. It's going to be looking out for its own profit. Government needs to be about something other than profit, which is why having businessmen and CEOs as presidents or as government leaders is very problematic. People sometimes think, oh yeah, let's get somebody in there who's a businessman and he'll run the government as a business and this will create an efficient government. No, it won't. Because that person will just try to privatize everything and undermine government. Government's purpose has to be the well-being of human beings, not profits. That's what makes government so unique. And whenever government's purpose becomes profits, that's when government is corrupted and undermined, and that's when it's not being effective. And that's what needs to be reformed. Understand that the biggest self-dealing in government is not welfare, the way that some conservatives like to say. Rather, it's corporations, it's lobbying, it's the military-industrial complex, it's subsidies which are given out frivolously to companies that don't need it, for example, like oil and gas companies. It's political favors, it's corruption, it's power, fame, status, and sex, which comes from having positions of authority and celebrity that come with being a politician. It's the revolving door of entering government to be a public servant, but then only doing that for a few years so that you can exit and then go become a lobbyist and work for some corporation to then help that corporation to corrupt the government, and using your government experience as just a way to undermine the government. This is the revolving door. This is very toxic and pathological. It's really traitorous, although it's not commonly thought of that way. Influence peddling, Ponzi schemes, and scams. These are truly the biggest problems with government, not welfare. Welfare is a drop in the bucket compared to the kinds of white-collar crime and corruption that plague most governments. So it's that needs to be cleaned up, and of course it can be cleaned up. But it takes active political participation and consciousness and education and an engaged citizenry to do that. That's our best bet. See? Starting some new organization is not going to work. We already have a massive organization called the government. Rather than scrapping that and trying to do something new, reform what we've got, because it's an evolutionary process, right? It's sort of like you're designing a human body. You don't just start with a human body from scratch. You start with some Neanderthal body, and then you make little adjustments to it to create the human body. You refine it. Likewise, you don't just start with a Neanderthal body, you start with a chimp. And then before a chimp, you start with like a monkey. And before a monkey, you start with like some mammal mouse. And then you go back to reptiles and birds and fish and all this. You know, you go down the evolutionary chain. This is how it works. Evolution doesn't just create stuff from scratch. So we got to keep evolving it. But we have to stay vigilant. And we have to be responsible for this process, because this process doesn't just happen automatically as we sit at home and watch TV all day. The difference is that we are active participants here. All right, that's it for part one. I know it's long, but there's so much material here and I'm so passionate about it. Stay tuned for part two. Next time we'll talk more about fundamental insights about the nature of how government works. We're going to talk about what conscious politics actually looks like and the core principles of it. So it's going to be less theory and more practice. And as we keep going through these parts into part three as well, it's going to get more and more practical and tangible, and there's going to be serious policy repercussions of the things that I'm saying. So don't just think that this is all philosophy. Make sure you stay tuned for those. I'll see you then.